Good afternoon. My name is Jackie Byther, and my topic of research for the past year and a half has been researching women with disabilities in the ancient Greek world, specifically how they are treated in ancient literary works and in ancient Greek culture as a whole. My interest in this subject was sparked when I had to do a research project for a course I was taking, Women and Gender in the Ancient World. Being chronically ill myself, I felt drawn to do a project about disabled women of ancient Greece. I found only one modern scholar, Martha L. Rose, who looked much into this issue, and even she has only one book chapter specifically dedicated to disabled ancient Greek women. She essentially says that the ancient Greeks considered all women as disabled in and of themselves, that disabled women were linked with women who were considered aesthetically displeasing, and that a woman's only real ability was to bear children. I found this response to be a little lackluster and too broad, so I felt compelled to dig down into primary sources myself and come up with my own conclusions. Before going further, there are some important issues to be aware of. One of the most important is that defining the term disability in both an ancient and modern context is hard. Today, scholars from a range of disciplines, along with people in the disabled community themselves, are still debating the definition of disability and what illnesses could be considered disabling. Moreover, our prevailing concepts of disability are very different from ancient Greece. For example, dwarfism and epilepsy could be considered disabilities today, but were sometimes thought of as sacred conditions in ancient Greece, and they were often related to religious practices. The ancient Greeks also didn't have a word that directly translates to disability. They had the word adunatos, which means unable or incapable, but it doesn't have the same connotations as the term disability in English. For the purposes of my analysis, I've decided to define the term disability as a condition that prevents people from fully participating physically and or mentally in a society. While it might not be a completely satisfactory definition, I believe that it is a good start. And in my research, I have found that women in ancient Greece who were not able to completely participate in society were treated very differently compared to their able-bodied counterparts. To gain insight into this issue, I'm going to look at the story of one particular woman, Labda the Lame, as she was often referred to, of the ancient Greek city of Corinth, and whose story is found in Herodotus's Histories. Labda's story is mentioned briefly, and as occurs frequently in Herodotus's work, it is a story within a story. Her story is told during a wartime meeting between many different ancient Greek city-states, including a Corinthian representative named Sophocles, who warns the Spartans about putting a newly captured city-states under the rule of only one person, also known as a monarchy. He uses Labda's story as a way to discuss the history of Corinth's experience with monarchies. According to Sophocles, Labda, the daughter of an elite Corinthian oligarch, upon reaching marriageable age, is rejected by all the members of the Corinthian oligarchy, who are known as the Bacchiadae. It is implied that they rejected her on account of her lameness. As a result, she was forced to move out of Corinth and marry a commoner man named Aetion in the faraway city of Petra. She gives birth to a son, Cypselus, who goes on to drive many Corinthians into exile and rule Corinth as a king. Both Cypselus and his son after him go on to commit many atrocities in Corinth, including murder, torture, and necrophilia. Now that everyone knows the gist of the story, let's dive a little deeper into the context. The story is supposed to be about the tyrant Cypselus, his tyrannical descendants, and the dangers of monarchy. It is therefore striking that Herodotus goes out of his way to tell this story. Also noteworthy is that nobody's physical features are described in the story except for Labda's lameness. Even her name, Labda, is derived from the ancient Greek letter lambda, as you can see on this slide, and scholars have suggested that this name could be based on the shape of her legs. In addition, it is important to bear in mind that most city-states in ancient Greece, along with Corinth, were massively patriarchal, with an emphasis on paternal rather than maternal lineage. In ancient Greek city-states, women were expected to be seemingly non-existent. Their story is thought to have little importance. However, Labda is mentioned in more detail and more often in the story than her husband. So why does Herodotus include Labda's story and emphasize her lameness? My first argument is that Labda and her deformed body are used in a way to find an origin for her descendants' deformed tyrannical rule. The first piece of evidence for this is seen before the Corinthian representative Sophocles tells the story. When the Spartans bring up the idea of establishing monarchies, Sophocles makes a poignant statement about his attitude towards monarchies. Quote, "This is like turning the universe upside down. Earth and sky will soon be changing places. Men will be living on the sea and fish on land. By discussing how monarchies are unnatural, then going into Labda's lameness, it insinuates a connection between the unnaturalness of monarchy and the unnaturalness of Labda herself. Furthermore, the story goes into the plethora of atrocities and unnatural acts Labda's descendants inflicted upon the people of ancient Corinth. Although the ancient Greeks didn't really have any concept of genetics, they did have a sense of traits being passed down from generation to generation, sometimes like inevitable curses. We can infer that Herodotus was implying that Labda was, in a way, the cause of the atrocities brought upon Corinth and her descendants. It is clear to see that the ancient Greeks commonly saw disabilities as both unnatural, a curse, and something that could be passed down from parent to child. We can also assume, based on these findings, that the ancient Greeks did not believe a disabled person could lead justly. My second argument is that Labda is used almost as a negative status symbol to demonstrate, by contrast, the greatness and nobility of the Corinthian oligarchy and reinforce the commonality of Aethyon and the lowly origins of Cypselus and his descendants. The idea of disabled women being tied to men of low status is corroborated by Herodotus in an earlier story of a Babylonian marriage auction. In this story, Herodotus describes a Babylonian village which, once a year, holds an auction to marry off all of its eligible women. They would first marry off the prettiest women to the highest bidders. Of course, the ones who were able to pay this amount of money were almost always the most wealthy and powerful in the village. After that, the auction runners would slowly go down the line in quality until they reached those who were plain, ugly, crippled, and deformed. For this, the auction's rules change. The auction runners would have to pay the auction goers money to take the girls with them. Whoever was willing to take a girl for the smallest amount of money would win. Because of this, people who would tend to take the non-able-bodied girls were commoners who were less wealthy. Herodotus refers to this as an admirable practice due to the fact that it ensured that every girl, including the ones who were undesirable, were married. This is noteworthy for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the story enforces the idea that by marrying Labda, Aethyon is put on the level of a commoner, while the Bacchiades act of rejecting her reaffirms her noble status. Secondly, because Herodotus recommends that other ancient Greek city-states should take up this practice, it seems like the problem of disabled women being left unmarried was fairly prominent. From our modern point of view, the idea of not getting married might seem pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. However, the institution of marriage was very different from women in ancient Greece. As mentioned earlier, ancient Greece was very patriarchal. It was generally not socially acceptable for women to have jobs or earn any kind of income outside of the home. The only acceptable way to succeed both socially and economically was to marry into a good and wealthy family. Because of this, many disabled women were denied economic and social opportunity to succeed. Labda, with the privilege of being born into a noble family, was at least able to marry a commoner. One can only imagine the treatment of women who were not from an upper social class. These experiences can seem very different from us. After all, this was about 2,500 years ago, but the main themes of these conclusions are still very prominent today. Disabled women are not only considered undesirable when it comes to dating, but they are usually denied economic opportunities in terms of getting hired for jobs. While researching this topic, I've also looked into ancient Greek medical writings, which discussed the treatment of women deemed sterile, and found that these ailments would seem to demonstrate how sterility was strongly correlated with mental as well as physical illness. I don't have time to go into this further, but I would be happy to discuss this topic more with anyone interested. The study of intersectionality between gender and disability is fairly new in the world of academia, and I would encourage anyone coming into the world of academia to keep this in mind, to try to educate yourself on the complexity of this topic and why it's still important today. Thank you all for listening to my research, and thank you to the organizers of the symposium for allowing me to present my topic. I'd like to have a special thank you to Professor Goyette for helping me with this research. If anyone has any questions or thoughts on this topic, please be free to email me at jebyther.eckerd.edu. Thank you.